Swanns, Part 10, starting at page 61. In another, a mountain of pink snow, at whose foot a battle is being fought. It seemed to have been frosted onto the glass itself, blistering it with its cloudy sleet like a window pane on which a few snowflakes remained, but snowflakes lit by some aura, the same, no doubt, that flushed the reredos of the altar with tints so fresh they seemed set there for a moment by a gleam from outside, about to vanish, rather than by colors attached forever to the stone. And all were so old that here and there one saw silvery age sparkle with the dust of the centuries and show, shimmering and worn, down to the thread, the weft of the soft tapestry of glass. One of them, a tall compartment, was divided into 100 or so small rectangular panes, in which blue predominated, like a great deck of cards resembling those meant to entertain King Charles. But, either because a beam of sunlight was shining, or because my gaze, as it moved, carried across the glass, snuffed and lit again by turns a precious moving conflagration. The next moment it had assumed the changing luster of a peacock's train, then trembled and undulated in a flaming chimerical rain that dripped from the top of the dark rocky vault along the damp walls, as if this were the nave of some grotto iridescent with sinuous stalactites, into which I was following my parents, who were carrying their prayer books. A moment later, the long lozenge-shaped panes had assumed the deep transparency, the infrangible hardness of sapphires, which had been juxtaposed on some immense breastplate, but behind which one felt more beloved than all these riches, a momentary smile of sunlight. It was as recognizable in the soft blue billow with which it bathed the precious stones on the pavement of the square, or the straw of the marketplace. Even on our first Sundays, when we had arrived before Easter, it consoled me for the earth being still, bare, and black, by bringing into bloom, as in a historical springtime dating from the age of St. Louis's successors, this dazzling gilded carpet of glass forget-me-nots. Two high-warped tapestries represented the coronation of Esther. Tradition had it that Ahasuerus had been given the features of a king of France, and Esther those of a lady of Guermantes with whom he was in love, to which their colors, by melting, had added expression, relief, light. A little pink floated over Esther's lips. Outside, the tracing of their outline, the yellow of her dress spread so uncuriously, so thickly that it acquired a kind of solidity and stood out boldly from the receding atmosphere. And the green of the trees, remaining vivid in the lower parts of the panel of silk and wool, but gone at the top, brought out in a paler tone, above the dark trunks, the lofty, yellowing branches, gilded and half obliterated by the abrupt slanting illumination of an invisible sun. All this, and still more the precious objects that had come into the church from figures who were, for me, almost legendary. The gold cross, worked, they said, by Saint Eloy, and given by Dagobert, the tomb of the sons of Louis the Germanic, of porphyry and enameled copper, because of which I moved through the church, when we went to our seats, as though through a valley visited by the fairies, in which a country person is amazed to see in a rock, a tree, a pool, the palpable trace of their supernatural passage. All this made it, for me, something entirely different from the rest of town, an edifice occupying a space with, so to speak, 4 dimensions, the fourth being time, extending the universe, its nave, which, from bay to bay, from chapel to chapel, seemed to vanquish and penetrate not only a few yards, but epoch and epoch from which it emerged victorious, hiding the rough, savage 11th century and the thickness of its walls, from which it appeared with its heavy arches plunged and blinded by crude blocks of ashlar, only in the deep gash incised near the porch by the tower staircase, and even there concealed by the graceful Gothic arcades that crowded coquettishly in front of it like an older sister, who, to hide from strangers, places himself smiling in front of a younger brother. Oh, excuse me. In order to hide themselves from strangers, place themselves smiling in front of a younger brother who is boorish, sulky, and badly dressed, lifting into the heavens above the square its tower, which had contemplated St. Louis and seemed to see him still, and plunging down with its crypt into a Merovingian night, in which, groping their ways, they guided us over the dark vault, as powerfully ribbed as the wing of an immense stone bat. Theodore and his sister would light for us with a candle the tomb of Sigebert's little daughter, in which a deep scallop, like the mark of a fossil, had been dug. It was said, by a crystal lamp which, on the night the Frankish princess was murdered, had separated of its own accord from the golden chains by which it hung on the site of the present apse, and without the crystal breaking, without the flame going out, had sunk deep into the stone, which gave way softly under it. The asp of the Combray church, what can one say about it? It was so crude, so lacking in artistic beauty and even religious spirit. From outside, because the crossroads which it commanded was on a lower level, its crude wall rose up from a sub-basement of quite unpolished ashlar, bristling with flints, and having nothing particularly ecclesiastic about it. The windows seemed to have been pierced at an exquisite height, and the whole looked more like the wall of a prison than the wall of a church. And certainly later, when I recalled the glorious apse I had seen, it would never have occurred to me to compare them with the apse at Combray. But one day, at the bend of a little street in a country town, I noticed, opposite the crossing of 3 lanes, a rough and unusually high wall with windows pierced far above and the same asymmetrical appearance as the apse of Combray. Then I did not ask myself, as at Chartres or Reims, how powerfully it expressed religious feeling, but involuntarily exclaimed, "The church!" The church, familiar, flanked in the Rue Saint-Hilaire, where its north door was situated by its 2 neighbors, Monsieur Rapin's pharmacy and Madame Loiseau's house, which it touched without any separation. A simple citizen of Combray that could have had its number in the street if the streets of Combray had had numbers, and where it seemed that the postman should have had to stop in the morning when he was making his rounds, before going into Madame Loiseau's and upon coming out of Monsieur Rapin's. There existed, however, between it and everything that was not it, a demarcation that my mind was never able to cross. Even though Madame Loiseau might have had at her window fuchsias, fuchsias which developed the bad habit of forever allowing their branches to run all over with their heads lowered, and whose flowers had no business more pressing, when they were large enough, than to go and cool their flushed violet cheeks against the dark front of the church. For me, the fuchsias did not for this reason become holy. Between the flowers and the blackened stone against which they leaned, if my eyes perceived no interval, my mind observed an abyss. One could recognize the steeple of St. Hilaire from quite far off, inscribing its unforgettable form on the horizon where Cambrai had not yet appeared. When from the train, which in Easter week was bringing us from Paris, my father caught sight of it slipping by turns over the furrows of the sky and sending its little iron weathercock running in all directions, he would say to us, "Come gather up the rugs, we're here." And on one of the longest walks we took from Cambrai, there was a spot where the narrow road emerged suddenly with an immense plateau, closed at the horizon by jagged forests, above which rose only the delicate tip of the steeple of St. Hilaire, but so thin, so pink, that it seemed merely scratched on the sky by a fingernail, which wanted to give this landscape, this exclusively natural picture, that little mark of art, that indication of human presence, when one drew near and could see the remains of the half-destroyed square tower, which, not as high, still stood next to it. One was struck most of all by the dark, reddish shape of the stones. On a misty morning in autumn, one might have thought it, rising above the stormy violet of the vineyards, a ruin of purple, nearly the color of the wild vine. Often in the square, when we were coming home, my grandmother would make me stop to look at it. From the windows of its tower, placed 2 by 2, one above the other, with the exact and original proportion in their spacing that gives beauty and dignity not just to human faces, it dropped at regular intervals volleys of crows, which, for a moment, circled about, shrieking, as if the old stones that allowed them to hop and flutter about without appearing to see them had suddenly become uninhabitable and emitted some principle of infinite agitation, struck them and driven them out. Then, after striping in every direction the violet velvet of the evening air, they would return suddenly calm to be reabsorbed into the tower, which was no longer baneful, but once again benign, a few of them sitting here and there, apparently motionless, but perhaps snapping up some insect on the tip of a turret, like a seagull as still as a fisherman on the crest of a wave, without really knowing why. My grandmother found in the steeple of St. Hilaire that absence of vulgarity, of pretension, of meanness, which made her love and believe rich in beneficent influence, not only nature, when the hand of man had not, as my great-aunt's gardener, shrunk and reduced it, but also works of genius. And certainly, every part of the church that one could see distinguished it from all other buildings by a sort of thoughtfulness that was infused into it. But it was the steeple that it seemed to become aware of itself, a firm and individual and responsible existence. It was the steeple that spoke for it. I believe, above all, that confusedly my grandmother found in the steeple of Cambrai what for her had the highest value in the world, an air of naturalness and an air of distinction. Knowing nothing about architecture, she would say, "My children, make fun of me if you like. Perhaps it isn't beautiful according to the rules, but I like its strange old face. I'm sure that if it could play the piano, it would not play dryly." And looking at it, following with her eyes the gentle tension, the fervent inclination of its slopes of stone, which approached each other as they rose like hands meeting in prayer. She would join so fully in the effusion of the spire that her gaze seemed to soar with it, and at the same time she would smile in a friendly way at the worn stones, of which the setting sun now illuminated only the topmost part, and which, the moment they entered that sunny region, softened by the light, appeared suddenly to have risen much higher, to be quite far away, like a song taken up again in a head voice an octave above. It was the steeple of St. Hilaire that gave all the occupations, all the hours, all the viewpoints of the town their shape, their crown, their consecration. From my bedroom I could see only its base, which had been covered with slates, but when on Sunday I saw them, on a warm summer morning, blazing like a black sun, I would say to myself, good heavens, 9 o'clock. I'd better get ready for Mass if I want to have time to go and give Aunt Leonie a kiss first. And I knew exactly the color of the sun on the square, the heat and dust of the market, the shadow made by the awning of the store which Mamma would perhaps enter before Mass, in an odor of unbleached linen, to buy some handkerchief which would be displayed to her under the direction of the shopkeeper, his chest out thrust, who, as he prepared to close, had just gone into the back of the shop to put on his Sunday jacket and soap his hands, which it was his habit every 5 minutes, even in the most melancholy of circumstances, to rub together with an air of enterprise, celebration, and success. Even after Mass, we went in to ask Theodore to bring us a brioche larger than usual because our cousins had taken advantage of the fine weather to come from Thiberzy to have lunch with us. We would have the steeple there in front of us, itself golden and baked like a greater blessed brioche, with flakes and gummy drippings of sun pricking its sharp point into the blue sky. And in the evening, when I was coming home from a walk and thinking about the moment when I would soon have to say good night to my mother and not see her anymore, it was, on the contrary, so soft at the close of day that it looked as if it had been set down and crushed like a cushion of brown velvet against the pale sky which had yielded under its pressure, hollowing slightly to give it room and flowing back over its edges. And the cries of the birds that wheeled around it seemed to increase its silence, lift its spire to a greater height, and endow it with something ineffable. That is where I'm going to stop today, at page 66.